All right, guys, Murph's here, and today we're going to talk about this. An IWI Galil Ace, now what would be referred to as a Generation 1, chambered in 7.62 by 3.9. Now, when we're talking about this, we are going to talk about a little bit of history. However, I'm going to start up at a different point. Most people go all the way back to like the 6-Day War and the Yom Kippur War to be able to talk about the history of the Galil. However, that has more to do with the granddaddy Galil and less to do with this particular weapon system here. So, what it suffices to say is that we're going to wind up talking about 3 different weapon systems throughout this. Let's go ahead and cover that right now. We're going to talk about this rifle, the actual start of the show, the Gen 2, how it is that they're different, and then what I refer to as the granddaddy Galil and how those are different. Now, the Galil was developed after some experience with the AK-47 and is really just a refined AK-47. And when I was a kid, I thought it was the coolest of the AK-47 variants. I absolutely love the Galil setup. Now, what a lot of people may not necessarily recognize is that the Galil wound up having a way longer service life with other militaries than it actually did with the Israeli military. There was early complaints that the Galil weighed entirely too much. It was about 9.5 pounds, which when you consider that most of them were chambered in 5.56, though there was a 308 variant, that's entirely too much weight for that particular weapon system. Now, when the U.S. started shipping the Israelis M16s, at that point the Galil wound up finding its way into rear echelon type use. However, apparently it would maintain some use with tankers. So the greater emphasis for Galil sales would wind up going overseas to South America, Southeast Asia, and Africa. Now, after quite a few years, there would eventually be some consideration for modernizing the Galil, for making it a little bit lighter, as well as trying to better entice some of those overseas sales to maintain their use with the Galil. So what would wind up happening was the Galil Ace family of weapon systems would come to be, and these have actually found a lot of success on the export market, being adopted by 15 different countries and actually being produced under license in Chile, Colombia, Vietnam, as well as the Ukraine. Now, one of the things that a lot of these different militaries were looking for was to have AK-style operating systems that are a little bit more modernized, even more so than the granddaddy Galil, while also being able to work with magazines or ammunition that they already had lying around. So the 5.56 rifles would wind up going to South America, and some of those rifles would actually be built out to be able to handle Galil magazines, the original 35-round 5.56 Galil magazines, as well as Stanag magazines. Now, for Vietnam, they would not necessarily want to move away from the 7.62 by 3.9 and the AK-47 magazine, which is where this particular rifle comes from. And really, if you think about it, guys, that's actually kind of savvy, because in general, whenever you're talking about adopting a whole new weapon system, specifically an infantry rifle, that's a lot of money. And that's not necessarily something we think about in the United States, because we spend a ton of money on defense type contracts. But even for the United States, we kind of balk at the idea of adopting things like new cartridges, because at that point you need a new rifle. You need a whole new stockpile of ammunition. You have to replace all of the stuff that you already have lying around. And then you potentially also need new magazines. That is a lot of cost that's just it's up front, right off the bat. You have to spend all of this money in order to be able to actually be able to operate the weapon system, be able to issue it out to troops. So if you start looking at some of the smaller countries around the world who still need arms, who still need weapon systems, and still want modernized weapon systems, stuff that actually is competitive in a military type setting, that's an imposing process. So it makes a lot of sense if you can go ahead and keep a cartridge that you already have a lot of lying around, and keep magazines that you already spent the money on, and just spend the balance of your money, the majority of your budget, on an all-new rifle. That is a very savvy choice. Now, that pretty much covers history. So let's go ahead and start talking about this particular rifle's features. Now, we have on this particular rifle a 16.1 inch cold hammer forged chrome lined CRMOV barrel. This is an absolutely excellent barrel. Now, some people might complain about the accuracy aspect of chrome lining, because chrome lining can kind of disrupt your accuracy, especially if you don't have good consistency in the layer of it all the way across your barrel. However, This thing is not meant to pick flies off a camel. This thing is meant to be a fighting rifle, and you get plenty of good accuracy out of chrome lining for that purpose. In addition to that, this rifle has pretty decent accuracy. We'll talk about that more as we move along. Now, this rifle comes with a birdcage flash hider, kind of like an M16. It is 5/8 by 24. You can take this off and add whatever it is that you want, because to most people, or to a lot of people, birdcage flash hiders, wow, that was hard to say, are more or less just glorified thread protectors. A lot of people are going to switch this up to something that'll better adapt to a suppressor or something like that. We'll talk about that more as we move along. Now, coming back to our front sight here, we have a winged central post front sight, which actually has a tritium vial set into the tip, which I absolutely love that. This rifle is set up to be able to fight in the night regardless of whether or not you have optics, and I appreciate that type of approach. Now, we do also have a kind of later style AK sight slash gas block combination right here, which is good, I guess. I've never really been broken up about it one way or the other. We do have ports set into our gas tube to be able to bleed off additional gases. Something that's important to keep in mind is that this weapon system, like a lot of AKs and some AR-15s out of the market, are overgassed. So that's something to keep in mind if you're fixing a suppressor to this and it's got a lot of back pressure. You might outrun the followers on your magazine. You might experience a lot of malfunctions. So keep that in mind with this particular weapon system. Also keep in mind that on the Granddaddy Galil, you actually had flip-up tritium night sights, and on the Generation 2 Galil Ace, you do not have a front sight at all. Right now, we do have a railed gas tube here, which this gas tube fits in by dovetailed cuts, which is pretty excellent in comparison to how a lot of AKs are set up, where they have that lever and all that type of stuff. This is really easy to take apart. You don't have to get in there with a magazine or anything like that to be able to break that lever free. And apparently it's supposed to somehow impact accuracy. I don't know how that works, but that's what the literature out there says. Now, we come back to our handguards here. The original Galil would have had, in its early production, wood handguards that would eventually go to kind of synthetic and a lot of its different variants that are out there. This has plastic rail covers over Picatinny rails all around the rifle. Now, these plastic rail covers are interesting because you can actually remove that little circle right there so that you can get access to this cutout where you can place a weapons light pressure pad. So that way it's not as exposed, and you can help with your wire management by being able to have it underneath this plastic handguard, which is kind of neat. I'm not a big fan of pressure pads to begin with, but I do appreciate the innovation with being able to work this into the handguard. That's a very interesting setup overall. Now, of course, we didn't have Picatinny rails on the Granddaddy Galil, and now this entire section has been replaced on the Gen 2 with M-LOK rails, which, as much as I think this looks better, this has a certain charm and appeal to it that the M-LOK rails don't have to me. I have to admit that the M-LOK rails are way more useful. Now, hanging off of my rails, I have a Streamlight HLX laser, which does have a red laser as well as a 1,000 lumen output. This is an excellent light, though it's quite large and quite bulky. And then I also have a hand stop located right here, which I run all the way out the end of the rails so that I get plenty of rail space off of this and a little bit extra that I can hang on to and really drive this rifle into my shoulder and all that kind of stuff. That's just my preference overall. Now, coming back to our top cover, we do, of course, have a railed top cover, which on some AKs is a little bit of an imposing factor because they have a tendency to rattle. However, I do have to say that this feels pretty solid. I don't get a lot of wiggle out of this top cover, which some AKs, you just tap against that thing and it rattles on you. Now, on top of this, I have an Aimpoint Comp M2, which I traded at a gun show, which I traded for at a gun show a couple years ago with a Crimson Trace laser. I had two options available to me, a Comp M2, which obviously I went with, and a Comp M4 that had a pretty decent dent in the housing. In hindsight, I should have gone with the Comp M4 because it at least runs off of AA's. This runs off of a proprietary lithium battery that looks like a really tall watch battery, and it's kind of expensive. But it's got really great battery life, so I can't really necessarily knock it in that regards. 2 MOA dot, and it has worked out great. I've had absolutely no issues with this optic. I've been using Aimpoint Comp M2s and M4s like my entire professional life, or a good portion of it. Now, let's go ahead and pop this open and take a look at our internals. Now this thing, in addition, you know, great, it's tight, but it's tight, and it's a little bit of a pain to take off sometimes. Okay. There we go. So we can see here we have a standard AK buffer spring. However, we do have, and I just lost a piece of it, these rubber stoppers at the end to try to help keep this thing from beating itself to death with its overgassing. Put that right there. And I'm going to avoid putting these parts on the couch this time around. Now here we can see that we more or less have a standard AK bolt. Nothing crazy going on here except that our charging handle is on the opposite side. And that is because this is a left side charging model. But our internals are all standard AK. There is nothing particularly special or interesting going on inside of the internals of the gun. It's pretty much what you would expect to see. Now, something to keep in mind with the Granddaddy Galil is that that was more or less a milled AK based design. This was meant to look more at a... this rubber stopper is really messing up my day. This was meant to be more along the lines of a stamped AK design, or stamped AK concept, so that they would be able to get this weapon system lighter. Now, the base weight is 7.5 pounds without stuff added to it. One currently comes in at 8.8. Now, they achieved this by going with a plastic lower section. Now, something to keep in mind, guys, is that this is actually just the portions of the gun that have to do with the magazine well right here, which is not necessarily needed. It's not unusual to see these trimmed down, as well as this pistol grip. This is kind of a one-piece type setup. KNS Precision does make an insert that allows you to be able to use whatever pistol grips that you want and replaces a lot of this and skeletonizes this magazine well. All of the actual operating portions of the gun are located in this metal portion of the receiver. Now, like I said, this is a left side mounted charging handle, which has this little gate right here so that you preclude, I should say, the ingress of foreign material. This little guy right here. So it moves around the charging handle while firing. This is a reciprocating charging handle. Now, we also have two safeties on this gun. We have a more AK style lever located on the side. However, you'll note that it does not come up to obscure the ejection port like it does on a regular AK. The original Granddaddy Galil. And it's a little smaller on the Galil Gen 2. And then on this side, you have a thumb operated safety located right above the pistol grip, which is a little stiff. So what I've found generally whenever it comes to working with this weapon system is that I turn the weapon on to fire utilizing the thumb safety, and then when I'm done shooting and I'm going back to safe, I sweep up with my hand on the more AK style safety. All right, now, of course, we have a AK style magazine release for lock and lock type magazines. This weapon system is a little picky on mags, so I picked up a US Palm magazine not too long ago, didn't really pay attention to the ribbing on the side of it, and it would not fit past this magazine well. However, when it comes to steel magazines, Tapcos, and PMags, I've had no issue being able to get them to lock in. Our trigger is actually a Galil Sniper trigger, which is pretty excellent. It is fairly light. I'm going to move it away from the mic and see if I can preclude some of the back noise. It's fairly light, it's fairly smooth with a very distinct let-off. It is a two-stage trigger, and it's based around a refined M1 Garand trigger. Now, on the original or granddaddy Galil, you would have an upturn charging handle so that you could sweep it from the top of the weapon system, which I always thought was really neat. Now, our rear sight is a flip-type rear sight with two different viewing ports, as well as tritium inserts in the rear, which is just absolutely fantastic. I really love these sights. However, unfortunately, with the height that I have this optic set at, I do not have coat witness at all. But I do have a knob here on the side of the optic to be able to detach it should, for some reason, it go down or it be, choked up with mud or something along those lines. Our pistol grip is fairly comfortable. I have no real complaints with the pistol grip. And it actually has a trap door, which I have a couple of spare batteries for this optic located in the trap door. Our folding mechanism, you press down on in order to be able to release it. This is a side folding and adjustable length of pole stock, 6 position. Kind of like an M4 stock, but, different. It came with a cheek riser that fits into these slots here on the stock. I haven't found it to be terribly helpful. I don't particularly care for cheek risers, and especially since I don't have a magnified optic to be able to work with, so not necessarily something that I considered. I have a simple padded 2-point sling attached to this weapon system. I've had it for a while. At some point I'll upgrade it. It's just not necessarily been terribly high on my list of things to do. All right, guys. Well, that's features. How does it shoot? All right, now, for shooting this gun, I really enjoy it. It's an absolute blast to shoot. It's a blast to take to the range. A couple of things that I will let you know right off the bat is that the recoil impulse is a little more disruptive than your average AR-15. And that is because we are dealing with a long stroke gas piston. So we have all of that mass moving from one end of the rifle to the other. It does kind of cause it to disrupt your sight picture a little bit more than perhaps a AR-15 or an X95 Tavor, anything along those lines. So that's something that might stand out to you while shooting the gun. However, accuracy-wise, you'll find a lot of people in print media talking about how this is a 1 MOA gun, and I'm sure, given the right set of circumstances, it absolutely is. I have been getting roughly 2 inches out of it, which for an AK variant weapon system, that's pretty excellent. That's really hard to complain about, especially since most people will tell you that AKs are like 4 MOA guns. This thing is well beyond that, and I appreciate that immensely. Now, what is this weapon system to me? Well, let's see. I originally picked this up as an extension of my truck gun concept, which I have taken this with me on road trips and stuff like that. It has been an ever-present faithful companion on those types of trips. I appreciate it. I think it's absolutely fantastic in that regard. I have competed with this rifle. This is actually the first gun I ever used in a 2-gun competition. And as much as the AK's manual of arms does not necessarily come natural to me, I don't dislike having it as a training option, something that I can flex over to and kind of get an appreciation for what it takes to be able to run this weapon system well. Now, of course, to come along with that, if you guys remember a couple years ago, what used to be very popular was the Cool Guy AK reload, where you would come in with your fresh magazine, sweep out the old magazine, and then rock and lock your new mag in, rack the weapon system, and get back to work. This weapon system does not lend itself very well to that. You'll note that the magazine release is actually kind of small, and it's kind of difficult to sweep that with another magazine. I never particularly cared for that reload. Something that I used to do with this rifle was that as I rotated up into workspace, I would extend my finger and allow the weapon system to kind of rest back a little bit into my hand so that I would release the magazine. I would then sweep it with my forearm and then rock in my new magazine. That was a pretty neat method up until one time I didn't properly hit that release, and then I jammed my forearm into the rib of a steel mag, and that really hurt. So what I've been trying to train around more here recently is securing my next magazine, sweeping out the old magazine, rocking in the new one, using my thumb to sweep out the old magazine, rocking in the new one, and then getting back to work. That's what I've been trying to work towards more here recently, and that's kind of what I would recommend with this small of a magazine release. It's not like some of the other guns you'll see out there in the market where people either bought it with an extended magazine release or have added in an extended magazine release. And I'm really not too sure how easy it would be to install an extended magazine release into this weapon system. If you've done it, let us know in the comment section so that we can kind of get an idea as to whether or not it's even worth the time. All right, guys, what do I suggest you guys use this weapon system for? Well, I most often refer to this as my Israeli better than AK. Because this platform is just exceedingly well built. It's well designed. It's properly laid out in order to be able to really get a lot of reasonable advantages out of the AK-47 weapons platform. One of my biggest issues with AKs is that there's a lot of fiddling and hand fitting that has to be done with a lot of the aftermarket rail sections to be able to get them to be as adaptable as an AR-15. Though this is not necessarily the most sterling example of, AR-15 style adaptability, it's also not that far off. And especially when you consider that this gun was unveiled in 2008, it's definitely an accurate representation of what was trending on the market at that time. Now, maybe that puts it more towards a suboptimal classification at this point, but it still works. And I would say that it works better than any stock AK-47, that it works better than a lot of AKs that people have put some time and energy into trying to optimize into something a little bit better as far as like stable mounting platforms and all that type of stuff. And it's definitely turning in better accuracy. So if you're looking for something that is an AK pattern weapon system to actually fight with, as opposed to just kind of have as your, to scratch an AK-47 itch, be it that you want the wood stock and all that kind of stuff in order to be able to have it be a more accurate representation of what a stock AK would look like, or you would just want to be kind of a trendy sort of guy with a pimped out AK-47. If you're looking for something that is actually a proven fighting rifle, this is a great choice. Now, if you want even greater optimization, I would say look at the Gen 2. As far as I understand, the Gen 1 is now discontinued. So hopefully you'll start seeing these pop up for fairly reasonable prices on the used market. But that M-LOK rail on the Gen 2 is going to make it a lot easier to be able to adapt this weapon system to get more of that, thumb over bore type grip and all that type of stuff, because it is a much longer rail than what you have on this particular weapon system. So that's something to consider as well. I'm not saying that you shouldn't get a Gen 1. I'm saying that if you're looking for hard duty use, a Gen 2 might be the better option. Now, this rifle was produced in this rifle specifically is in 7.62x39, and I wanted 7.62x39 because that's what I always thought was a major miss with the original Galil, was that it was not chambered 7.62x39 and it did not run on AK mags. So as soon as this hit the market, I wanted it. I had to have it, and here it is. Now, this rifle was also produced in 308. and there was a limited number produced in 545. The Gen 2 is supposed to be taking 545 and keeping the other cartridges, but also supposed to be bringing 545 as a standard offering. Whether or not that actually comes through, we'll see. All right, guys, I think that pretty much covers my thoughts on this particular weapon system. I hope you guys found this interesting, and it's pretty much what I got. So, have a good day.